Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a moment to refresh and get energized for our final session of the day, which is the State of the Field Native CDFI Industry Data. So this session will be facilitated by Crystal Langholtz and Florence Lucas Sterling. So I'll turn it over to Crystal for introductions of our presenters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Langholtz. I'm Chief Operating Officer for Oweesta, and we are so excited about the session. For us, we have alluded to and discussed and thrown out stats this whole week of from some of the data that we're going to talk about and share today. The work that our Native CDFIs did in 2020 was nothing short of miraculous, really, truly incredible. And so it's important to sort of reflect on that. And, we at Oweesta are so privileged. You report to us quarterly if you're our borrower. You get to share your stories through surveys, through our various work that we do. And so for us, it's really critical to make sure that we're giving that data back to the field in a meaningful way. And so one of the ways that we want to do that is we are producing annually, basically a Native CDFI impact report. And we, in your chat, you'll see some dropped links to basically our 2020 sort of visual state of the field, which we're going to talk through today. Which is great, and talk a little bit about what that data tells us. And then we're actually going to look at some other data that's available to us in some research efforts that we're making together that tell us a little bit about what's happening in the Native CDFI industry and what all that data means. So with that, I am very excited to introduce my co-panelist and give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, although I feel like they hardly need introductions. But Flo, will you introduce yourselves to our team here?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Florence Lucas, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Oweesta Corporation. And I'm really excited to present this data today to you that we collected.
Great, and I'm Andrea Mader, Principal Director at Sweetgrass Consulting. I think most of y'all probably know Sweetgrass at this point, but we're a small consulting firm and we work really regularly with Oweesta and with our Native CDFIs with the Opportunity Through Impact System, or what we call OTIS. So we'll be bringing in some of that impact data into the conversation as well.
So the first thing we wanted to talk about is our side-by-side report. And so this is a report that we actually produced a couple years ago and then took a kind of a break from it. And we've decided this year to produce this report going forward on an annual basis. So we're going to present some of that data today that we've collected. And most of this information has come from our quarterly borrower reports that we received from our loan portfolio, where we asked them to fill in a bunch of impact information. And this really helps us gauge the performance of our portfolio and everything that our Native CDFIs are accomplishing with our loan funds out in the field. So the snapshot with our side-by-side that we're going to talk about today is we focused on 28 of our Native CDFI revolving loan funds.
Great, and then as mentioned, one of the other data sources we'll be using today is our OTIS system. The Opportunity Through Impact system is an impact tracking system that's specifically designed for and by Native CDFIs. And it really tracks each Native CDFI's unique impact, and the data there can assist with grant writing, reporting, capital investment campaigns, and more. And the system that we're currently using to sort of host this OTIS impact system is called Outcome Tracker. And the Outcome Tracker software allows us to pool together all the individual OTIS member data in order to understand industry-wide trends, and of some we are presenting today. Currently, we have 25 active CDFIs on the OTIS system. And the data that we're presenting today is from 16 of those CDFIs. They're from 9 states: Alaska, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and Wisconsin. Multiples from several of those states. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of where the data is coming from, fairly well represented in terms of business, consumer, and home lenders as well.
Awesome. So yeah, we thought instead of having sort of an individual presentation on all these different reports that we have in all these different data sources, let's just throw it all together and show you what's happening in 2020 with our native CDFIs. And we're so happy to release today, and it'll be popping up for you in your chat if it isn't already, a housing report that we did. And so much gratitude to our native CDFIs that participated in this survey and research that we did last year. Specifically, this research was sponsored by Freddie Mac, and we were really trying to look at opportunities and challenges for our native CDFI housing lenders, trying to think through a lot of different issues such as secondary market access, lack of housing stock, and really highlight some innovative solutions and make some recommendations both to our native CDFIs, but also to the funders and investors that care about housing in native communities, and give context in that space. And so you'll see here the map of sort of how this survey and research was conducted. We had survey respondents through all of our sort of native CDFI areas from Hawaii to Maine that were willing to share their challenges and also their amazing scope of their housing work. We also did key informant interviews with some of those survey respondents, but then also some different individuals as well of our different native CDFI leaders, both that were wanting to start housing programs or that were new in their journeys, as well as those that were well-established housing lenders to learn more about their efforts. And so that research got all consolidated into the housing impact report, into this opportunities and challenges for native CDFI housing lenders that we are sharing out today. Woo, you came to the session, you're the first to see the release, how exciting. And so we'll be looking, when we look in sort of some of these areas of impact, we will be also drawing upon some of the data and conclusions from that report as well. So how we chose to present this research and all these different areas of impact that we have, it became, I loved this session this morning, listening to NACA and about the work of the Aboriginal financial institutions in Canada. And one of the themes that we heard a couple times in that was sort of the importance of using socially resonant and culturally appropriate impact metrics. You know, how do we tell the story of native CDFIs on their own terms? And so we have been thinking about this at Oweesta for a long time and are glad to have had a lot of thought partners in those efforts over the years. But many years ago now, and we keep refining it and tweaking it and working with it, we received a lot of feedback from you all about what were the specific impact areas that you were most passionate about. What were you trying to accomplish as a native CDFI? And we kind of grouped them. We heard several themes emerge around those different areas. And one of those areas was around wealth creation. For those of you who don't know, Oweesta means money or item of exchange, sort of this broad idea of wealth, not just money, but also, you know, kind of creating a culture and community of wealth in the communities we work with. We also talked, one of the areas of themes that emerged was around individual empowerment and self-sufficiency. So seeing communities become less reliant on tribal and federal government and having access to financial services. One that also resonated, we saw a lot of focus in, was around whole person wellness. So our people, and that actually emerged today in the conversations with NACA. What a great session that was. We see financial, physical, emotional, spiritual wellness, right? That it's about more than just the loan we make, that it's about being able to give back to the community, being able to participate in the community, and feeling empowered, feeling like we have financial empowerment. And we know, of course, from research that that affects one's physical health and all aspects of their life. Sovereignty, right? So the access to businesses and diversity of jobs and sort of the self-sufficiency of the broader community there. And then lastly, the last theme that emerged is seventh generational transformation, right? And so themes about our youth, the youth entrepreneurship and financial education efforts that we do, cultural heritage and connectedness, all sort of emerged underneath those themes. And so all of these are how we are choosing to share back the impact statistics that we're going to share today, according to this broader impact matrix around all the areas that our Native CDFIs were trying to lead positive and lasting change in their community.
Yeah, so before we go into detail about each of our impact goals, we'd like to give you an overview of the collective impact. And this is, we collected this from our side-by-side report. And in the calendar year of 2020, our portfolio, the 28 Native CDFIs, closed 2,734 loans. The total was $71,276,743. The average loan size was $26,070, and it all went to 2,930 Native American borrowers. So we really reached out, we're able to reach a lot of people in our Native communities. And this is really, hats off and kudos to our Native CDFIs who are working so hard out in the field.
There's a few add-ins here from the OTIS side as well. You can see the sort of bubbles on the right-hand side that we had around 11,395 new clients reach out and work with Native CDFIs through the OTIS system. So that might be folks, just submitting an inquiry saying I'm interested in services, all the way to folks who are fully receiving a loan. So a variety of different folks there, but that's sort of the number of new clients that the CDFIs have worked with, just the 16 active OTIS groups in 2020. The median age of folks who are engaging with Native CDFIs is 40 years of age. In the OTIS realm of being, we're looking at about 45 different states being represented. So, folks living in 45 different states have engaged with Native CDFIs, and we're representing 84 individual tribes in that process as well, right? So lots of diversity and variety in the folks who are reaching out for services from Native CDFIs.
Lastly, I just wanted to add from our quarterly borrower reports, we always ask these questions. We ask the questions, how much were you unable to finance due to lack of capital? And we still see those capital needs. And we at Oweesta, of course, are working diligently to close gaps on those numbers, but we still see fundraising, we still see gaps of 40 million. And then exponential growth of the industry, right? You reported needing 85 million next year to satisfy that loan demand. So see also those needs coming through here. And of course, this is just, as we look at the data, this is just a couple smaller subsets of the broader field that we have. This probably deeply undercuts or deeply underrepresents all of the total impact of the field, but it is, sort of the most comprehensive look that we can do at it. So I just think it's important to note that these numbers are amazing. And I bet if we did get every single Native CDFI in there and every single loan made, it would probably just be even more amazing. So.
All right, we've got a little Mentee survey here for you all to engage a little bit with. So it's just a pretty quick question. So you've got several options here. You can use your phone and hold it up to the screen and scan that QR code. You can enter this URL into your address bar in your browser, or you can simply type in mentee.com either in your phone or on your internet browser, and it'll ask you for a code, and you'll enter the code 98775081. And if you could respond to our initial question here, we would certainly appreciate it. You'll see it once it gets up on the screen here, and I'll take a second for you to make sure you can get the QR codes before sharing the question with my screen share. But the question for everyone is, how do you envision using this collective data in your advocacy and fundraising efforts? We'd like just a few ideas here and there. Not everyone needs to respond, but just wanted to get a little bit of sense of how you all would envision using that previous slide of data in your advocacy and fundraising efforts. So again, I'll give just a couple more seconds here for folks to view the QR code and the links, and then I'll share my screen of the results as they come in. There's a little bit of a delay in our live version, so I just want to give it a little bit of time here before we share.
That's such a good question, Andrea, because I mean, obviously this work is a lot of energy on your end. For our Native CDFIs who provide this information. So, so excited, you know, it's really important to think about how can we leverage it? How can we use this data to better tell our stories? Awesome, we see some results coming in. Ooh, I love it.
Great. Yeah, this is super helpful. Thank you all for engaging on this. We definitely see this data, and we'll continue with some deeper dives right into different topics, but especially that collective impact can really be a very powerful tool for fundraising and advocacy. Funders especially are really excited to see this sort of level of collective impact and having those conversations with advocacy groups as well, right? If you're taking this to the Hill and having conversations about the importance of Native CDFIs and the work that you all are doing, and that we're hoping that this data can help in those conversations, maybe tribal councils and things as well, right? Can have a lot of different uses across the board. So thank you so much for engaging there. We'll continue on here.
So sovereignty tells the story of business development supported by our Native CDFIs. So in total, there was 321 business loans closed for a total of $38 million. And then there was 92 agriculture loans for a total of $4 million.
And then some supporting data from OTIS, and we're able to bring in some idea of the amount of loans that were requested in business. And this is much smaller, as you can see, than in comparing to the total business loans closed. But it gives us a little bit of a sense of the average loan request, which I think is the more interesting component here, in saying that on average, we're looking at business loans coming in at a request of about $76,850 per loan request, which is a little bit larger than I think we would normally expect to see. And we're seeing kind of small business loans coming in here rather than saying microloans, for example. So just supporting that, continued need for small business development. Of the businesses who are engaging with Native CDFIs on the OTIS platform, we're seeing that 60% of those businesses are either in the startup or initial growth phases. So many startups in that realm. And that 59% of those businesses are less than 5 years old. So this is, I think, in a support of what a lot of folks are experiencing. You're seeing a lot of startups who engage, who need that, working capital and, equipment costs, those sorts of things to start up a new business. So the data there is supporting that, that understanding with business loans. We also have some job data here and some revenue and profit information. So we're looking at roughly 45 jobs to be created by business loan applicants. And again, this business loan applicant pool is much smaller from the OTIS group, and it's only for 2020, right? So just to put some sort of caveats on this, that I think this data would normally be much higher than it is. And we're looking at 16 native CDFIs, not all of whom do business loans. And we are only looking at 2020. And I can tell you business loans were lower than they are traditionally from 2020. So just to throw some caveats on there, but 45 jobs created is a pretty cool number. 171 jobs are currently being provided by those business loan applicants. All right, so we're looking to create 45 new jobs. We're currently offering 171 jobs currently. And those are FTE equivalent, right? So we're taking those part-time jobs in there as well. And then generally speaking, from the businesses that the CDFIs are working with, we're looking at about $7,000 in median profit that those businesses have on an annual basis, and about $71,000 in median revenue that they're bringing. A ton more data here, just to say, but this just gives us a little bit of a snapshot around some of the business development that we're looking at from the OTIS side.
So Andrea, that really seems to me that those are probably like solo entrepreneurs, right? With 70,000 in revenue. So that would definitely resonate with maybe just like, one person's salary plus their expenses to me when I look at that.
Yeah, definitely more or less the bulk of them are those single entrepreneurs, sole proprietorships. There are a couple that have, one or two employees, but yeah, by far and large, most of them are those sole proprietors.
So our CDFI support their communities in regards to individual empowerment and self-sufficiency by providing products and services related to predatory lending and bankability. Many of these efforts are centered around our consumer lending. So in total, our native CDFIs financed 2,147 consumer loans last year for a total of $9,468,430,000. There was another 9 million in requested consumer loans, and the average request of those consumer loans was about $9,789, so close to $10,000 each.
And then you see a little bit of a graphic here on the right-hand side from some of those OTIS metrics. And again, these are a little bit sort of dedicated around predatory lending and bankability. So you can see here that about 79% of the folks working with native CDFIs have a checking account. 55% of those folks have a savings account. 34% have a credit card. And 26% reported that they've used a predatory loan recently. And that's within the last 5 years that they've used a predatory lending product. So again, all things that we're looking to change and sort of impact and improve. And hopefully over time, we can tell some of those stories with OTIS as well, but gives you a little bit of an idea of where those consumer folks are coming from. The next impact goal that Crystal mentioned was whole person wellness. This is the sort of idea around financial stability, but it's also about the sort of personal goals as well. Here we've shared some of those financial wellness metrics and indicators. So we have 48% of clients feel that they're securing their financial future. 60% of households have a budget or a spending plan. And 54% of clients share their financial knowledge with others, right? So we're seeing that transference of knowledge happening as well. So, fairly good here on those percentages. Could see some increases, but we're seeing some good activity there. And then we have one sort of level of confidence question here with the two options. There is an option there that's very are not at all confident. So nicely, no one said that, right? So we're seeing that how confident are you that you can achieve your financial goals? That 57% feel somewhat confident and 35% feel very confident. So again, we'd like to potentially see those shift a little bit over time to being maybe more confident, but this gives you an idea, little window into whole person wellness around financial capability.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's a very similar question in the FINRA study in 2016, sort of about how confident people feel in their financial, being able to accomplish their financial goals. And a lot of people sort of statistically across the board feel very unconfident around their financial goals. And so it's so interesting to see that our Native CDFI clients feel so confident. And I wonder how much of that is sort of the empowerment of working with the CDFI and sort of this sort of general empowerment of even being able to sit down in a space and talk with somebody about their needs. What interesting data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's definitely one of the key takeaways, and some of the data that we'd like to continue in the future to help support this, right, is to say, how do we tie in that technical assistance and training data and participation into this process? Because of course, some of the data here from OTIS will include people that have only received TA or training, and it's not limited to folks who have received a loan, for example. So we're getting a sort of bigger pool of data. In that way, we think we have data from the total, I think we have roughly 4,000 folks whose data is being contributed to here. So that's something that would be really great to look at over time, right? Starting to overlay these with CDFI activity, because, Crystal, as you mentioned, I do think there is a really strong correlation, even causation, in the participation with the CDFI and getting that hands-on technical assistance in having these success over time. All right, 7th generation transformation. This is actually kind of a tricky impact goal for OTIS. The way that we've decided to sort of track this over time as an industry is really kind of in a follow-up sense. And so that's something to sort of mention about this data. A lot of it is at what we call a baseline or an intake level, right? So it's when you first talk with that client, and you get a little bit of an idea of who they are, what their demographics are, what they need from you. You get that information when you first start speaking with them. And then we're able to start talking about impact over time by following up with those clients. OTIS has been active for several years now, but follow-up is still a challenge, and I think always will be. And especially, say, engaging with consumer lenders, or not consumer lenders, but consumer borrowers. Right, they get a $500,000 loan, and it's really hard, 3 months after that, 6 months, a year after that, to be able to engage with those clients again and say, what did this loan mean to you? What did it do for your life? How did it impact you? So just to say that the 7th generation transformation is something that's really important in supporting, the next generation of folks in communities, right? Sharing that knowledge, building folks up. But a lot of this data, to mention, that we specifically try to gather around 7th generation transformation is done in follow-up. And so we have some gaps there. In the interim, what we've presented here on this slide from OTIS is looking at the distribution of participation in programs based on age groups, right? Because one of the key ideas of 7th generation transformation is that we see that next generation engaging with the different loan products, and especially over time becoming more financially secure and, overall increased wellness. So this chart here, you can see that we have some percentages, and this is of the total percent of loan clients. And these will be people who either receive a loan or have started working with the CDFI to get themselves loan ready. So it's not just specifically to loan recipients. Is that we can see here that in that consumer realm, that of all the consumer products, that 5.7% of those folks are under 25. And then if we up that age range, that 13.9% are under 30. You can see those similar pieces in home and business, right? But you can see here actually that the home folks, that's where we're seeing the most young folks coming to. which I thought was actually really interesting. I would have expected it to be consumer, and that folks are coming in and getting small loans to help build credit or consolidate debt. But really, we're seeing this larger push for young population to access home products, which I think is really amazing. Folks are seeing the value of homeownership and acting on that, and we can see that happening with our younger populations. Less in business, but I think that's one that I would have expected, right? Is to see a little bit lower percentages, actually fairly low percentage in business. But it can give us an idea of maybe a gap, right? That, if we can, I've heard a lot of programs recently, right, about getting into schools and starting to say, even before folks get out of school, saying that starting your own business is a reality. It can be very real for you. And making sure that we try to engage with that on an education level, and engage with those younger populations. We'll also see this, and there's a really big conversation right now about succession planning in businesses, right? Like, we are seeing a lot of our business owners are getting much higher in age, which is supported here, right? Like, most of these business owners are older, and soon we will see those businesses start to turn over. They'll need to be succeeded, and we might see this a little bit of a jump in that data over time as well. So just give a little bit of insight here into the 7th generation piece.
So wealth creation is certainly one of the most impactful ways our CDFIs engage within their communities. In total, last year, there was 174 housing loans closed for a total of $19,509,440. There was $2 million requested in loans additionally, and the average loan request for those housing loans was about $114,828.
Great. So wealth creation, I think Crystal mentioned some of this as well, but wealth creation is one of those kind of big areas for CDFIs, right? So this is where a lot of that, sort of housing development is coming in. It's where a lot of our credit score work is coming in that wealth creation, increasing savings, increasing income, budgeting. All of that will come into the sort of wealth creation mode. And so some of the pieces that we've brought in from OTIS here show you a little bit of this. So on the left-hand side with our little black arrows here, you can see that our median credit score for everyone engaging through OTIS is 634. We've got a pretty standard range here, with a few more folks kind of sitting in that sort of average to good range of credit score, but we see everyone across the board there. And with the one caveat that we do see a decent amount of folks who don't have credit established, which is also something that I think we experience a good deal in Native communities and in other communities who are in financial deserts and being able to access credit, right? So, but generally speaking, especially for housing situations and folks creating wealth with housing, that we're seeing pretty healthy credit scores, and that I think that's a lot of that is due to the work being done by Native CDFIs to help do those credit building activities as well. And then we look at our median household income, again across the board from everyone. We're looking at $28,800 for median household income. Pretty low. Just to throw that out there, especially when we're looking at the areas that we're looking at, that the median household incomes that we would expect to see would be probably more around 55 or 60,000. So our median household income is low, and that's something that, again, that reflects a lot of different elements, but something that is important to acknowledge as we start to try to build wealth over time, is looking at some of these pieces. And then on the sort of right-hand side of this graphic here, you can see a little bit more around housing lending, right, as a way to build wealth. And so the types of loans that are being requested in terms of housing through OTIS, the bulk of them are home purchase, right? So you see 81% that are home purchase. We've got about a 31% that are new construction. Then we have, sort of various levels here of engagement with rehabilitation and repair, refinances, down payment assistance loans, second mortgages and gap financing, and some that are in that sort of other categories, might be HELOCs and things of that nature. And so just to give a sense of what products folks are looking for. And then the graphic to the far right is looking at current housing situation. So I like to look at this in terms of a little bit of housing demand. So the inner pie graph there is showing the percentage of folks and their current housing situation. So right now we can see in here that those folks who are currently owning a home, currently renting is where I want to start here. So that sort of bottom pie chart, that's 55% of the total folks are renting currently. And then you can see the pull out based off of that 69% of those who are currently renting would like to own a home, showing a pretty high demand for housing, right? And home ownership. That 26% of the folks who currently own their own home, that 71% of those folks would like to rehab or improve their loan. So another pretty open and clear loan product request there on that rehab and repair. And then the final one that we have to pull out for here is folks who are currently living, with family or with friends and things of that nature, but they're living in someone else's home. And of those folks, which is 12% of the total, and that 47% of those would like to purchase their own home, and 33% would like to start renting. All right, so it just gives you a good deal of information about what housing can look like in Native communities and where the demand is looking and growing. And so we still are seeing a really large demand for home ownership, and as well as potentially having, especially in the CDFI realm, looking into rehab and repair, as well as a loan product and service that would be of interest in terms of building wealth around home ownership.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in housing in a more nuanced way. Because I told you at the beginning, we did this really interesting housing report where we got to talk a lot about and learn a lot about sort of the housing space and sort of the exponential growth in that. And we were really interested in that because when we did our snapshot in 2018, we sort of asked, what are the products that you want to add in the next year? And 40% of you said that you wanted to add a housing product, right? That there was a really strong need to provide those services. And then of course, so many of you did. And then it turns around that as we saw needs around home rehab this year, as people were in their houses, that there's sort of this exponential interest in sort of the work and supporting housing markets in Native communities. And so just to kind of pull some of that out and talk about it, the things that we learned, there were, of course, a lot of barriers that were identified when we did that research report. And not surprisingly, one of the largest ones that folks circled in on was a need for qualified homeowners. So this makes sense to us in context. We see broader interest and engagement in becoming housing counseling agencies to build housing counseling, and in order to support those development services that ultimately support home ownership efforts. But not surprisingly, we saw needs for housing stock for those folks that came from communities that had infrastructure challenges. That was identified as a challenge. And also just a need to build and engage qualified staff. That there was sort of this acknowledgement and understanding that housing lending was different than sort of some of the small business and consumer lending that we were doing. And so there was a need to sort of not only build out the number of staff, but also potentially draw in some staff that had expertise and interest and engagement in the housing space. And then lastly, one of the other areas that came up was needing NMLS licensing. And so That, of course, is the state mortgage licensing that you can have. And that was because if you want to lend off reservation, in many states, you need to be licensed through the state. There are some exceptions, right, for some of us that are nonprofits that might have an exemption through their state. But in general, you need to be licensed through the state. That's a big process. And so that was identified as a challenge. And so this is helpful as we sort of think through how can we support this area in the future? You know, how can we create training and technical systems that supports those areas? And Andrea shared this before, but a lot of you are just doing first mortgage lending. You have really great portfolio products that are adapted to your communities. We also see a lot of rehabilitation, down payment assistance, and other kinds of lending products that support the housing space. You know, we were sponsored by Freddie Mac, so thank you, Freddie Mac, for engaging with us in this space. But, you know, as we think through capital access, the secondary market, the importance of the secondary market cannot really be overstated as we think about housing. That is, of course, how capital recycles in non-native communities and other housing markets. And so, you know, thinking about access to the secondary market is important when we talk about capital. And so we wanted to kind of get a sense of where people were, kind of take their temperature, so to speak, around what their needs were and, you know, where they sort of felt their understanding of secondary market products was. And so 60% of you were basically like, we're neither uncomfortable or comfortable. But there was a sense of wanting to learn what those products were, wanting to build capacity to access those that was there. And then there was a lot of desire, if you see on the chart in the left, to sort of current structuring goals for our Native CDFI housing lenders, that while a lot of you were kind of focused portfolio lenders, which is to say your lending efforts were pretty much, you know, were staying in your portfolio. You weren't really selling them. You weren't brokering another product. It was a kind of nuanced product specific to your field that was staying in your portfolio. There was sort of this idea over time that you wanted to diversify out the products that you had available, that potentially you wanted to broker the 184 and still have your portfolio product, or package the 502 and then still offer your portfolio product. And there was really the sense of like, it's not so much that we want to get rid of our portfolio product. We love our portfolio product. It really is important to us, but more about we want to have a variety of different housing products that fit the needs of our communities and different tools in our tool chest that could support that. So with that kind of gives you a good sense of what was the main results of that report. And Heather, of course, shared out the link earlier, but we encourage you to look through that and to read it and get a sense of just sort of the state of the current field around housing. So no state of the field that talked about 2020 would be complete if we did not talk about pandemic response, right? That has been, of course, where so much of our energy and efforts and work that we have done this year has gone. You know, we did ask in our quarterly bio report, we asked folks, you know, how many hours of COVID specific technical assistance that you did helping families that were struggling due to COVID, or specifically asking the question, you know, helping small businesses, for example, do their pivot. And it was amazing to see in our portfolio that y'all did 2,500 hours of just COVID specific response, which is just amazing. And basically, we just all need to get a long vacation. But I know some of us are still in the thick of it and still thinking through how to support our community's economic response. But just wanted to highlight a couple of those statistics that sort of came out through. What I think was really interesting about the Native CDFI COVID response was that, you know, there was this understanding that you know, that our community needed loans, but so much of what we heard was really more about people need grants. Like our small businesses need grant money. And instead of like trying to shoehorn your borrowers into a lending product, what y'all did is you went out and you found grant money to give to your borrowers. So it's really neat. We saw a lot of COVID specific lending, right? There was 5 million basically in loans requested. The average size of those loans was about 3,600, right? So they were relatively small loans. But we did see sort of this exponential response around granting programs, right? You saw programs like Cook Inlet out that was deploying millions of dollars in grant money to small businesses, amazing relief efforts in Hawaii. Oh my goodness, the amount of work that they went through in their re-granting efforts. But in the OTIS space, we saw about 10,393,000 requested in grants through those various programs, and then saw that average grant request was not very much. It was just about 1,600. But for a struggling family, for a struggling small business, right, that can make all the difference. And then you can see here sort of those employment statistics around that. So yeah, really, truly incredible efforts in response to COVID-19. And that, of course, is just from the OTIS data that we have. And of course, as we think through, as we see other data sets, I know NCN did a survey about their COVID-19 response broader to the industry. We might see even more really amazing statistics emerge. And looking forward with that, we have another Mentee. Ooh, fun. Andrea, will you explain that one to us?
Yeah, definitely. So it's very similar in terms of accessing it, right? You can get it with the QR code, you can type in the URL link, or you can just type mentee.com and enter the code 194792228. The link should be dropped in the chat here any second as well if you need to access that. But we'll give you a couple of minutes here to access this. This Mentee is going to be a ranking question, right? So we're just going to ask you, of all the sections of data, so based on those impact goals that we talked about, which section of data do you personally feel like is most exciting? It can be most exciting, most useful, really just where you were like, oh, that's really cool, and might be able to use that. So we have 6 categories, including the pandemic response. And so we'll just like you to come in and provide your ranking in that. So it's pretty straightforward on the phone. It's a little bit interesting. I definitely would suggest doing it online. It's a little bit easier to pull the answers up and down. And it looks like we actually do have some coming in. So I can pull this over. Yeah, and get a sense. So we'll let folks vote here a little bit. Looks like we got 1 vote so far. So this becomes more fun if we get more folks to vote. 2 have voted. And I think usually, what we usually find, so we produce data like this for our OTIS groups fairly regularly. And that's one of the benefits of being part of the OTIS system and collecting this data all the time, as being able to sort of talk about this on an individual level as well. So we find that to be a pretty powerful tool for the individual CDFI, seeing it on this collective stance, but then also seeing it individually. And I'd say the bulk of the time, it really is that wealth creation that comes out pretty strong in the data that we're looking at, as well as the sovereignty piece, especially for business lenders, in pulling that out. For consumer folks, we're definitely seeing some of that individual empowerment and self-sufficiency as being some of the stronger data points and sort of areas of interest, I guess. And then, of course, in 2020, how much pandemic response data has been very, very useful for folks. We've seen people take it and do some really cool advocacy things and get even more grant money showing the impact of that COVID response as well. So lots of variety of ways to utilize this data on an individual level that can can really provide some changes for folks. Great. Looks like here we've got a decent amount of folks who've come in and voted. And with our top rank, individual empowerment, self-sufficiency, still shifting a little bit. We've got wealth creation pretty high up there, whole person wellness as well, then followed by sovereignty, seventh generation transformation, and the pandemic response data. So thank you all for playing along a little bit. Just wanted to get a little bit of a sense of where people find the data to be most exciting. It's always interesting, since I love all of it and nothing's wrong with any of it, but it's just nice to see where folks kind of land and what they feel like is most impactful.
Well, we're going to leave sort of the rest of the time open to answer some questions, and we've seen some answers come through here. And so we want to just kind of circle back and talk about some of those that we've seen come in. So that's exciting. So we'll just kind of start up at the top, but please, please, please use the question and answer, use the chat feature right now. And any questions you have specifically about the data sets, but then also trends over time that we've seen, we'll do our very best to sort of answer that. And one of the first ones that came in was from Gary. And they said, will there be a Native CDFI impact report that compares 2020 data with earlier years to get insight on the impact of the pandemic? That is that's a great question, Gary. We did collect some data specific to the field. And then of course, just to further kind of contextualize, we did share those two, these great infographics that Andrea shared out, and we have the housing report. But coming out in a couple months will be that side-by-side report. And that will basically be of the CDFIs that are in our loan fund, which is growing to be a statistically relevant sample. It's amazing. Thank you for being part of Team Oweesta's portfolio there. We're starting to be able to compound those annually without any additional effort from you. So great, right? Because you're doing those quarterly borrow reports and we have your financial statements, so we can pull that data and you don't even have to submit a survey anymore. So we're going to start putting out sort of that on an annual basis for you all. So look for that and watch for that. We don't currently have a specific report about COVID-19 coming out. I think NCN is planning on they have done some surveying and work like that. And so we were going to kind of see what that report was. And I have actually, we're great partners with NCN. So I've actually shared over a lot of our raw data, of course, protecting your identities, but with Jackson and the team there to sort of try to throw in our data into that broader report for the field. So trying to do some of that and support the field, but that's a great question, Gary. And I will just add that if there are ever areas that you're especially interested in, around research, around things that you need, tools that would be really helpful from an advocacy perspective, it's very useful to know that because we might have the data already, right? In which case that's great. Let's just pull it and make it usable and accessible to you. But if we don't have the data, right, we can look at that, putting that. We try to do at least 1 or 2 broader research reports a year. Like I said, last year was housing. This year, we're going to be talking about the value of development services and sort of the strength of Native CDFI portfolios. We're doing a risk analysis project. Trying to show once and for all that our portfolios are less risky than investors perceive them to be. And so that will be kind of our report for 2021. But all that to say, if there are research ideas or things that are useful tools like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Oweesta, because that's really important, right? We exist to serve you. Our data exists to support the broader advocacy and needs of our movement. So very helpful to get that question and to hear that there's interest in that space. I'm going to keep going down. Anything else that Andrea or Flo want to add to that while I'm...
I did actually want to mention that with OTIS data, because we are getting in a sense of doing this, pretty regularly. We pulled a lot of data for 2019. did it now for 2020, we'll probably do it next year for 2021, that like over time, we'll be able to see little snapshots of this in comparison there. But Gary, I see your point about potentially formalizing that comparison of OTIS data and saying, how does what we just shared now compare to what we saw in 2019? And that's something that would be, much like fairly easy to put together. So definitely putting a light bulb on for me to make a note of, and potentially try to put something out that shows that comparison over time with just OTIS data as well.
We got another question this morning based on the data points shared this morning with the Global Financial Institutions panel. What do you see as the similarities in data points collected by Canadian counterparts, and what are the differences? Do we see ways to collaborate in the future to show a more condensed picture of Native nations with North American? I think the answer is yes. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of energy around micro enterprise. Sort of in both areas. And so that is, of course, most of our Native CDFIs, 80% of our Native CDFIs are micro enterprise and small business lenders. The AFIs, of course, in Canada are that is where most of them got their start, although some of them are adding housing, right? And I also feel like we have a lot of shared values. I think if we were going to have a conversation, and we did somewhat this morning, right, around what we were looking at, themes around taking care of children, which for us, we categorized under this 7th generation wellness. We talked about health. And so I think that those are all really interesting. And they, of course, are a couple years ahead of us on a broader project. They did something similar to OTIS, and they have more of their AFIs percentage-wise on that system. And so they do have access to data that we're still sort of in process of gaining access to and delivering. So some of their more intentional information, right, that follow information that we're sort of lacking, they have. So I think that over time, that we're going to be able to really put those in dialogue with one another and do some really intense shared advocacy. And for those of you who saw that panel this morning, they have done some amazing research reports. Oh my goodness, 60 pages. They're oftentimes getting a lot of government support and sponsorship in that space. So I think as we think about how could we do that, I think there's a lot of conversations to be had of, how can we encourage the CDFI fund, and can we connect with the CDFI fund for some of that longitudinal data that they might have, right? As we sort of think about the scope of that, because they have a lot of access to some of those resources in a meaningful way. But yeah, I think there's a lot of great synergies there, and I loved that question. Anything, Andrea or Flo, that want to kind of jump in on that? I don't know if you all got to hear the panel this morning. What a great panel.
Yeah, I would just mention too that I think I'm really excited to see how we might partner around the metrics that we gather. And that I've heard a lot of ideas around what First Nations groups are gathering, and I'm really excited to kind of see how that plays out. My sort of data geek mind goes crazy there, and I want to see and compare and see how we might be able to improve what we do and maybe share back. So I'm really excited about potential partnerships and collaboration in the future on that data collection. And Crystal, as you mentioned, that research side. It sounds like there's some really amazing research happening that we'd really love to be able to replicate to some degree with our Native CDFIs.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And then I think there's a question for you, Andrea, here about the list of tribes and states underneath the broader OTIS.
Yes, definitely. So I can provide a list of the states and tribes. There's just a lot, of 84 tribes, to list them all out on an infographic is kind of a lot. So I can definitely provide that information, though. I think there's probably a way we can share it out with folks specifically. But knowing, of course, that we're representing certain states, that's kind of limits the pool of tribes a little bit just in who participates in OTIS. But it's something I can certainly provide, is give an idea of what those states are and what the tribes are as well. To give a brief sense, I know some of the top tribes, just in terms of total number of participants, are going to be Native Hawaiians, especially with that COVID response. We had a ton of participation with our Native Hawaiian groups. We also have a good deal of sort of number of loans coming in from Wisconsin. So all of the tribes represented in Wisconsin take up a good deal of our survey population in OTIS as well, just to give a little bit of an idea. But I can definitely provide that data.
Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is because the Wisconsin Indian Business Alliance, all of their native CDFIs are on the OTIS network. So we have that sort of broader field of Wisconsin, which is so cool. I also wanted to circle back a little bit on kind of Gary's questions about 2019 to 2020 and sort of what were the general like themes or differences that we saw. I got to sort of compare the two data. Every year I get to write our NACFA and I get to sort of sit down with the data and marinate in it and see the changes and the things that's evolving over the field. I love it. I love it. Such a geek too. Andrea and I are in good company. But with that, just to share a little bit of some of the things we saw. So the previous year in 2019, our borrowers reported deploying 40 million. And this year, I think we shared that they deployed at 71 million. And part of that is just because we have more borrowers in our portfolio. But if you subtract out that and you compare so that it was just the borrowers in 2019 and just the borrowers that we had in 2020, we actually saw annual growth of about 138% in loan volume. So kind of exponential, amazing growth, sort of that, especially given that some of you, your CDFIs might have been closed for a minute, right? Where you were building out remote systems and doing some of that. So really a lot of that. We also saw kind of huge pivots sort of in our impact numbers, right? We always ask those questions every quarter. We've asked the questions, how many businesses did you support? Were they new? Were they existing? How many did you potentially, jobs did you help retain versus jobs did you help create? And I will say historically, what we have seen is that our native CDFIs are oftentimes working with new small businesses. And so they're doing a lot of job creation. What we saw in 2020 was a lot of job retention. We saw a lot of lending that was going to our existing small business partners and really supporting them. So it does not mean that we didn't see job creation. We did see some job creation. We actually saw, I think, 54 new small businesses started from the statistics in our portfolio, which is just amazing. That there was that entrepreneurial spirit was alive and well in Native communities for sure, even in the middle of the pandemic. But in general, we kind of saw that flip-flop in our portfolio to a lot of retention and a lot of existing small businesses that were being supported. So that's just some of those data pieces that we saw sort of in the 2019 to 2020 sphere and sort of how they emerged. Mm-hmm. Did we have any last questions come in? We must have been super comprehensive with all that data. Oh, goodness. Well, I want to express my gratitude and I want to give Andrea and Flo anything else that you guys would like to share before we sort of turn it back over to Linnell and Crystal to close out our day.
I think I just, I always want to encourage folks that, this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the data. I think, both in terms of what was shared with the Oweesta side-by-side as well as with OTIS. And so just to mention that we're always here and open to hearing any requests for data. I think Crystal mentioned that in her response to Gary, but just to reiterate that really we want this data to be useful to individual CDFIs and the industry as a whole. And so just, be vocal. And that's the only way that we're able to really engage and be in the know about what's needed. Obviously, we're on a good pulse with that, but for individual requests, we're here, right? And would love to talk in more detail about the data whenever it's needed.
And Flo, any last sort of closeout thoughts on your part that you want to circle back on any of the questions we answered or share any?
No, I think you guys both covered it pretty in depth. I did want to just make one comment about the comparison with our Canadian groups, and that is I think it'll be very exciting to be able to compare what's happening in the lower 48 to what's happening in Canada. I'm from a border town, and so I have a lot of people that I know that live in Canada. And my tribe was originally from the Manitoulin Island area in Canada, so I have a lot of connections there. And the stories I'm hearing from Canada are very similar, to here. So I think if we can partner with them and do some sort of like comparisons and data sharing, I think you're going to see some very similar stories from our Canadian Native American groups. And so that's kind of exciting to actually be able to do that. You can speculate, all you want and make assumptions, but it'd be really nice to have those data points and be able to do those comparisons. So that's exciting to be able to work with that. Another thing is I think it's great that we're going to do an annual side-by-side report. So that will allow us starting next year to be able to do comparisons from one year to the next and look for trends and things like that. And so that's another exciting thing to look forward to going in the future. So we just keep building on our data collection, and that's great.
Awesome. Yeah, and snaps to our lending team that compiles that, because that is no mean feat. Oh, that's a lot of stats to put together on our end. Well, thank you all so much. We are going to turn it back over to our amazing CEO, Crystal Cornelius, to sort of shut and close out our day. Thank you all again.
You're muted, Crystal.
Sorry about that. I said that was a wonderful last panel and a wonderful last way to conclude our day. I would really like to thank all of you, our partners, believers, Native CDFIs, for joining our second day of our Native Capital Access convening today. And tomorrow, our final day, we have a really poignant day, I believe. We start at 11 o'clock a.m. Mountain Time, and we will be opening with a plenary panel, The Future of Our Native CDFI Industry. We then will have 3 networking and capacity building panels, and we'll be closing tomorrow with a plenary discussion with the Partners for Rural Transformation, a group of 6 CDFIs that work in the deepest pockets of poverty, Oweesta being a member of that group representing Indian country. And we're going to discuss the similarities, collective voices, and what we really need to do in this moment to make sure our marginalized communities are represented not only themselves, but on a federal level, policy level, and be able to incorporate into the financial mainstream. And finally, we will be closing with remarks from Lisa Mensah, CEO of Opportunity Finance Network. So again, thank you all so much for joining today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and I hope each and every one of you have a wonderful evening. Chi miigwech.